October 15th, 1954. The date would burn itself into Thomas's memory like a brand, though he could never speak it aloud. He was 8 years old then, small for his age, with dark hair that fell into darker eyes. The fever had taken his voice 3 winters before, leaving him with only gestures and silence in a world that demanded words. Thornvale Orphanage sat on the edge of Millbrook County, a place forgotten by maps and progress alike. The building rose from the Pennsylvania hills like a prayer carved in stone, its windows catching the weak autumn light. Sister Margaret had run the place for 22 years, her smile painted on each morning like rouge, her hands steady as stones when she served breakfast or tucked children into narrow beds. But that October morning, her hands shook as she poured the oatmeal. Thomas noticed everything because silence had made him watchful. He saw how Sister Margaret's eyes never quite met theirs when she called them to gather in the main hall. He saw how she smoothed her gray habit with nervous fingers. Most of all, he saw the black cars that waited in the circular drive like sleeping animals, their chrome bumpers gleaming despite the overcast sky. 9 children sat in wooden chairs that October morning. 9 children who had no families, no names in any ledger that mattered. Mary with her red braids. Little Johnny who still wet his bed. The twins, Sarah and Samuel, who spoke in whispers only to each other. Ellen, who drew pictures of houses she'd never lived in. David, who could fix anything with his small, clever hands. Peter, who saved bread crusts for the sparrows. Amy, who hummed lullabies to herself. And Catherine, barely 5, who still sucked her thumb when she thought no one was looking. Thomas made 10, but somehow he knew he was different. The way Sister Margaret's eyes skipped over him when she counted. The way her voice caught when she said there would be visitors today. Important visitors. The man who came through the front door wore a long coat that smelled like medicine and winter. His name was Dr. Whitmore, and his voice was soft as flannel when he spoke to Sister Margaret in the hallway. Thomas pressed himself against the wall, trying to catch their whispered words. The program needs subjects, Dr. Whitmore was saying. Young minds, untainted by family influence. Children who won't be missed. Sister Margaret's voice was smaller than Thomas had ever heard it. They're just babies. Some of them will have opportunities they could never dream of, the doctor finished. Better than this place. Better than charity and hand-me-downs forever. Thomas felt ice form in his chest. He crept back to the main hall, where the other children waited, their faces bright with the possibility of something new. Mary was braiding Amy's hair. The twins held hands and swung their legs from their chairs. Catherine had fallen asleep against Johnny's shoulder. None of them understood what better meant in a world that had already forgotten them. Sister Margaret returned with Dr. Whitmore behind her. The doctor's smile was wide and white, like teeth in a skull. He carried a leather case that clicked when he set it down, and papers that rustled like autumn leaves. Children, Sister Margaret's voice cracked like old wood. Dr. Whitmore has come to tell you about a wonderful opportunity. The doctor stepped forward, his shadow falling across the children like a cloud over the sun. You're going to a special place, he said, his voice honey-sweet. A place where smart children like you can learn and grow. Where you'll have new friends and teachers who understand your potential. Thomas watched the doctor's eyes. They were pale blue, like winter ice, and they never looked at any child for more than a moment. As if they weren't quite real to him. As if they were something else entirely. Will we stay together? Mary asked, her hand finding Amy's. You'll make new friends, Dr. Whitmore said, not answering. Better friends. And you'll be helping with very important work. Work that will help other children someday. Thomas felt his hands ball into fists. Something cold and wrong moved through the room like a wind before a storm. He wanted to stand up, to wave his arms, to somehow warn the others. But what could a boy with no voice do against men, with smooth words and papers that made everything legal? The doctor began calling names from his list. One by one, the children stood and followed Sister Margaret to the small office where their few belongings had been packed into paper bags. Thomas watched their faces disappear through the doorway. Mary's freckled cheeks. Johnny's gap-toothed smile. The twins' matching blue eyes. All of them trusting, all of them believing in the promise of something better. When Catherine's name was called, she looked back at Thomas with sleepy eyes. She raised her small hand and waved, her thumb finding its way to her mouth one last time. Thomas lifted his own hand, his throat burning with words he couldn't speak. The office door closed behind them like a coffin lid. Thomas sat alone in the main hall as footsteps echoed through the building. Adult voices, efficient and businesslike. Car doors slamming. Engines starting. Through the window, he watched the black cars disappear down the winding drive, carrying his friends toward their promised better life. Sister Margaret found him there an hour later, still sitting in his wooden chair, staring at the empty seats around him. "Thomas," she said, and her voice was different now. Hollow, like an echo of itself. "Dr. Whitmore said you weren't ready yet. Said you needed more time here." She knelt beside his chair, her habit pooling around her like spilled ink. For the first time in 3 years, Thomas saw tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered, so quietly he almost didn't hear. "I'm so sorry, child. I believed," but Thomas was looking past her toward the front door that had closed behind his friends. 9 children had walked through that door. 9 children who trusted in promises and believed in better things. Deep in his silent heart, Thomas knew they would never walk back through it again. As evening fell over Thornvale Orphanage, Thomas pressed his face against the frosted window glass one more time, searching the empty drive for any sign of their return. The autumn wind rattled the windows like fingers trying to get in, and somewhere in the distance, a door that had never been locked before turned its key for the first time. The weeks after October 15th moved like winter sap, slow and cold through the empty halls of Thornvale. Thomas counted 21 days by scratching lines into the wooden floor beside his bed, though time seemed broken now, moving in circles instead of straight lines. The dormitory that once held 10 narrow beds now held only 1, and the silence pressed against his ears like water at the bottom of a deep well. Sister Margaret moved through the orphanage like a woman walking in her sleep. She still wore her painted smile during the day, but Thomas saw how it cracked at the edges when she thought no one was looking. She still served meals, though now she made just enough for 2. She still said evening prayers, though her voice caught on the words about keeping children safe through the night. Thomas had learned to be invisible long before the others disappeared. A boy without a voice becomes a shadow, moving through rooms unnoticed, listening to conversations meant for no ears at all. In the days following that terrible October morning, this gift became his curse. He heard the telephone conversations. 3 days after the children left, the phone in Sister Margaret's office rang at 9:30 in the evening. Thomas had been in the chapel, as was his habit now, sitting in the back pew where candlelight flickered against stained glass windows that showed saints with gentle faces and children at their feet. "Dr. Whitmore?" Sister Margaret's voice carried through the thin walls. "How are they settling in? Are they well?" Thomas crept closer to the office door, his bare feet silent on the cold wooden floors. Through the keyhole, he could see Sister Margaret pacing, the telephone cord stretched tight in her hands. "I see," she said, and her voice was smaller than he'd ever heard it. But surely Mary and Amy could write letters? They knew their letters well enough. A long pause filled with the sound of her breathing. "No visitors allowed during the adjustment period." "Yes, I understand. But doctor, Catherine is so young, barely 5 years old. If she's frightened." The conversation ended with the sharp click of the phone being placed back in its cradle. Thomas watched through the keyhole as Sister Margaret sank into her chair, her painted smile finally washing away like chalk in rain. More calls came in the following weeks, each one shorter than the last, each one leaving Sister Margaret more hollow, more broken. Thomas began to understand that the questions she asked were never really answered, that Dr. Whitmore's voice grew colder each time she called. "The children are progressing wonderfully," the doctor would say. "They're adapting to their new environment. Some adjustment difficulties are to be expected, but there were never any letters, never any voices asking to speak to Sister Margaret. Never any proof that 9 children were living and breathing and remembering the woman who had raised them from babies. Thomas discovered Dr. Whitmore's true nature on a gray November morning when the doctor returned unexpectedly. The black car appeared in the drive like a bad dream come back to haunt them, and Thomas watched from the chapel windows as the tall man in the long coat stepped out, carrying his leather case and his papers that made everything legal. This time, Thomas was ready. He slipped through the halls like smoke, positioning himself behind the chapel doors where a crack in the wood gave him a clear view of Sister Margaret's office. Dr. Whitmore sat across from her desk, his pale eyes reflecting the weak autumn sunlight. There have been some complications, the doctor was saying, his voice gentle as a funeral director's. Nothing serious, you understand, but the children require more intensive treatment than we initially anticipated. Sister Margaret's hands twisted in her lap. What kind of complications? Are they sick? Are they hurt? They're responding well to the program, Dr. Whitmore said, not answering her question. Their young minds are proving remarkably flexible, adaptable to new ways of thinking. Thomas felt ice form in his stomach. He pressed his eye closer to the crack in the door, watching as Dr. Whitmore opened his leather case and withdrew a folder thick with papers. I need you to sign these additional consent forms, the doctor continued, for their continued treatment, their continued care. What kind of treatment? Sister Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. Psychological evaluation, cognitive testing. Nothing harmful, I assure you. We're simply trying to understand how young minds work, how they can be improved. The word improved hung in the air like smoke from a snuff candle. Thomas watched Sister Margaret take the papers with shaking hands, her eyes scanning words she didn't understand. Medical terms, legal phrases, permissions for things that had no names. If I could just speak to one of them, she said. Just hear Mary's voice, or see how little Catherine. I'm afraid that's impossible, Dr. Whitmore cut her off, his voice sharp as a blade. Any contact with their former life would disrupt their progress. You wouldn't want to undo all the good work we're doing, would you? Thomas saw the trap, closing around Sister Margaret like a steel snare. She signed the papers because she believed she was helping. She signed them because she trusted in the goodness of men who spoke of helping children. She signed them because she had no choice, and because a woman alone in 1954 had no power against men with official papers and government seals. But Thomas, hidden behind the chapel door, saw something else in Dr. Whitmore's pale eyes. He saw the way the doctor smiled when Sister Margaret wasn't looking. He saw the man's fingers caressed the signed papers like they were made of gold instead of promises. Most importantly, he saw the small notebook that fell from the doctor's coat pocket when he stood to leave. Thomas waited until the black car disappeared down the drive before slipping into the office. The notebook lay on the floor beside Sister Margaret's desk, its leather cover worn smooth by handling. Inside, Thomas found pages covered with neat handwriting. Names, dates, numbers. Mary Gallagher, Subject 7, Exceptional Response to Treatment. Memory Suppression Successful. Johnny Morrison, Subject 8, Required Additional Conditioning. Speech Patterns Eliminated. Sarah and Samuel Davis, Subjects 9 and 10, Twin Studies Proving Valuable. Behavioral Modification Complete. The list went on, reducing his friends to numbers and observations. Clinical notes about children who had been made to forget their own names. Ellen, who drew pictures of houses, was now Subject 11, Artistic Tendencies Successfully Redirected. David, who could fix anything, had become Subject 12, Mechanical Aptitude Shows Promise for Specialized Training. At the bottom of the page, Thomas found his own name. Thomas Mueller, Subject 1, Speech Impediment Makes Him Unsuitable for Current Studies. Recommend observation period. May prove useful as control subject if other subjects show unexpected complications. The notebook slipped from his numb fingers. He understood now why he had been left behind, why Dr. Whitmore had looked through him instead of at him. He wasn't special. He wasn't protected. He was simply broken in a way that didn't serve the doctor's purposes. But broken things sometimes see more clearly than whole ones. Thomas carefully placed the notebook back where he'd found it, knowing Dr. Whitmore would return for it. But the words were burned into his memory now, along with the faces of 9 children who had trusted in promises of better things. That night, he knelt in the chapel and pressed his hands together as Sister Margaret had taught him. He tried to pray for Mary and Johnny and the twins and all the rest. But the words wouldn't come, not even in the silence of his mind. Instead, he made a different kind of promise. To remember, to carry their names and their faces through whatever years lay ahead. To become the keeper of a truth that no official record would ever contain. Outside the chapel windows, November wind rattled the glass like fingers trying to get in. Somewhere in the darkness beyond Thornvale's walls, 9 children lived in a place where their names had been taken away, where their memories had been stolen, where they had been turned into numbers in a doctor's notebook. And only Thomas, the boy who couldn't speak, knew they had ever existed at all. The next morning, Dr. Whitmore's notebook was gone, and with it, the last official proof that 9 children had ever lived at Thornvale Orphanage. But Thomas kept his promise, holding their faces close to his heart like pressed flowers in a book that would never be burned. 20 years would pass before he found the courage to look for the truth behind Dr. Whitmore's kind eyes and cold promises. September 1974. Thomas was 28 now, his dark hair touched with gray at the temples, his hands rough from 20 years of work that kept him close to the only home he'd ever known. Thornvale Orphanage had been officially closed since 1959, 5 years after the fire that destroyed all the records, they said. 5 years after Sister Margaret had quietly left in the night, carrying nothing but a small suitcase and eyes that had seen too much. But Thomas had never left. He couldn't. The county had hired him as groundskeeper in 1961, when he turned 15 and aged out of the foster system. They paid him enough to live in the small caretaker's cottage behind the main building, enough to keep the grass cut and the windows boarded against vandals. What they didn't know was that Thomas unlocked those boards every morning and walked the empty halls like a man visiting a graveyard. Every room held ghosts. The dormitory where Mary had braided Amy's hair by lamplight. The kitchen where little Johnny had stolen cookies when he thought no one was watching. The chapel where the twins had whispered their secret language during prayers. Thomas swept these rooms with religious devotion, removing dust from memories that only he could see. The apple tree still stood in the courtyard, gnarled and ancient now, its branches reaching toward windows that would never again frame children's faces. Thomas had built a small bench beneath it, where he ate his lunch and listened to the wind move through leaves that rustled like whispered names. On the morning the reporter came, Thomas was tending the small cemetery behind the chapel. 7 graves lay there, children who had died before Dr. Whitmore ever arrived. Fever, scarlet fever, accidents that happen when the world pays no attention to forgotten children. Each grave bore a simple stone marker with a name, dates that began and ended too soon, and a small wooden cross that Thomas carved himself. But there were 9 other graves that bore no markers at all. 9 small mounds of earth that Thomas tended with the same care, though no one else knew they were graves. No one else knew that children were buried there. Thomas was pulling weeds from the unmarked graves when he heard footsteps on the gravel path. He looked up to see a young woman approaching, maybe 25, with auburn hair and serious eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She carried a notebook and wore the kind of clothes that said she came from the city, from a world where people asked questions and expected answers. "Are you Thomas Mueller?" she asked, her voice gentle but determined. Thomas nodded, his throat tight with the familiar frustration of having words trapped inside him like birds in a cage. "My name is Claire Davidson. I'm a reporter with the Philadelphia Inquirer." She gestured toward the abandoned building. "I'm writing a story about institutional failures in the 1950s, about children who disappeared from places like this." Thomas's hands stilled on the weeds. 20 years of silence pressed against his chest like a stone. "I've been going through old records," Claire continued, cross-referencing missing persons reports with institutional closures. "Thornvale keeps coming up in my research, but there's almost nothing in the official files. It's like the place barely existed." She opened her notebook, pages fluttering in the autumn breeze. "But I found something interesting. A mention in a county budget report from 1955 about payments made to a Dr. Jonathan Whitmore for special educational services provided to Thornvale residents. Services that cost the county nearly $10,000. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. $10,000 in 1955 money. Enough to buy 9 children's silence forever. The payment stopped abruptly in November 1954, Claire went on, watching Thomas's reaction carefully. Right around the time, this place started having problems. Financial troubles, staff leaving, and then the convenient fire that destroyed all the records. Thomas stood slowly, his knees creaking like old floorboards. He looked at this young woman with her notebook and her questions, and for the first time in 20 years, he felt the weight of carrying the truth alone. Claire followed his gaze toward the apple tree, then back to the unmarked graves at his feet. These aren't in any cemetery registry, she said quietly, but someone's been caring for them. Someone who knows what happened here. Thomas walked toward the tree, Claire following a few steps behind. He sat on the bench he'd built and patted the space beside him. She sat down carefully, her notebook balanced on her knees. For a long moment, they sat in silence while leaves rustled overhead like whispered secrets. Thomas pointed toward the main building, then held up 9 fingers. Then he pointed to the unmarked graves and held up the same 9 fingers. Claire's pencil moved across the page. 9 children, she said softly. 9 children who lived here and died here, but aren't in any official records. Thomas nodded, tears burning behind his eyes. Can you tell me their names? Thomas took a stick and began scratching in the dirt at their feet. M-A-R-Y, I-M-Y, G-O-H-N-N-Y. The names came slowly, carved into earth that had kept their secrets for 20 years. Sarah, Samuel, Ellen, David, Peter, Catherine. Claire copied each name in her notebook, her handwriting careful and respectful. These children died here. Thomas shook his head violently, then pointed toward the road that led away from Thornvale. He held up 9 fingers again, then made a gesture like something being taken away. They were taken, Claire said, understanding dawning in her voice. But they died later, and somehow they came back here. Thomas nodded, though the truth was more complicated than gestures could convey. The children had died, yes, but they had never really left Thornvale at all. Their bodies might have been buried elsewhere, in unmarked graves or forgotten plots, but their souls had found their way home to the only place that had ever wanted them. Claire looked toward the main building, her reporter's instincts sharp as razors. There's more, isn't there? Something in the building itself. Thomas stood and walked toward the basement entrance, hidden behind overgrown ivy on the building's north side. A steel door, painted green once, but now rust-eaten and weathered. A door that had been locked since November 1954, when Dr. Whitmore made his final visit to collect his forgotten notebook. Thomas had kept the key all these years, hanging on a nail in his cottage like a talisman of guilt and responsibility. He'd never had the courage to use it, never had the strength to face what lay behind that steel door. But now, with Claire's questions pressing against 20 years of silence, he felt something shift inside his chest. He touched the door with one weathered hand, then looked back at Claire with eyes that held 2 decades of unshed tears. You want me to help you open it, she said. It wasn't a question. Thomas nodded, knowing that once that door opened, the last of his silence would finally break apart like winter ice in spring water. The key turned in the basement lock with a sound like breaking bones. 20 years of rust fought against Thomas's trembling fingers, but the door finally gave way with a groan that seemed to come from the earth itself. Claire stood beside him, her notebook forgotten in her hands, as the smell of old concrete and something else, something sweet and terrible, drifted up from the darkness below. Thomas had carried a flashlight from his cottage, its yellow beam cutting through air that hadn't moved in 2 decades. The wooden stairs creaked under their weight as they descended into a basement that official records claimed didn't exist. Each step took them deeper into a truth that had been buried with cement and silence. The basement was larger than it should have been, stretching beyond the footprint of the building above. Someone had expanded it, carved new rooms from the Pennsylvania bedrock, created spaces that served purposes no architect would ever put on blueprints. The flashlight beam swept across white-tiled walls that belonged in a hospital, not an orphanage. Drain grates in the concrete floor, hooks mounted in the ceiling, tables with leather straps still attached. "Dear God," Claire whispered, her voice echoing in the underground chamber. Thomas moved the light slowly, revealing more rooms branching off from the main space. Each one told part of a story that no official record would ever contain. A room lined with filing cabinets, their metal drawers hanging open like hungry mouths. Another room with beds so small they could only have been made for children, each bed equipped with restraints that had never been meant for healing. In the third room, they found the bones. 9 small skeletons lay arranged on metal tables, still wearing the rotted remains of Thornvale's gray orphanage uniforms. Each skeleton bore a metal tag wired to its wrist like a cruel parody of a hospital bracelet. The tags bore numbers, not names. Subject 7 through Subject 15. Thomas fell to his knees beside the nearest table, his flashlight beam illuminating a skull that was too small, too fragile. Mary's skull. He knew it by the slight chip in the left front tooth, where she'd fallen from the apple tree when she was 6 years old. The metal tag read, Subject 7, but Thomas whispered her real name into the darkness. Claire moved between the tables with the careful steps of someone walking through a graveyard. Her notebook shook in her hands as she recorded what no newspaper should ever have to print. "The medical equipment," she said, her voice tight with horror. "These aren't treatment rooms. They're laboratories," Thomas said. The word came out as a croak, rusty from 20 years of disuse. But it was the first word he had spoken since the fever took his voice at age 5. Claire spun toward him, eyes wide with shock, but Thomas was beyond caring about his silence now. The truth demanded words, and the dead children deserved to have their story told. "They brought them here," Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "All of them. Dr. Whitmore said they were going to a better place, but this was the place, right here under our feet." He moved to the next table, where Johnny's small bones lay still and accusing. The boy who had saved bread for sparrows, who had wet his bed and been ashamed, who had trusted in promises of a better life. "Experiments," Thomas said, the word bitter on his tongue. That's what the notebook called them. Psychological research, behavioral modification. They wanted to see how far they could push young minds before they broke. Claire found her voice, though it came out strangled. "How do you know this?" Thomas walked to the filing cabinets, their drawers yawning open like wounds. Inside, scattered papers told the rest of the story. Dr. Whitmore's real research, funded by government agencies whose names were blacked out with heavy ink. Studies on memory suppression in children. Tests on how trauma could be used to create compliant subjects. Research that used orphans because they were invisible, expendable, forgotten by a world that had never wanted them in the first place. "I saw the notebook," Thomas said, pulling out a file folder thick with photographs and clinical notes. 20 years ago, I found it in Sister Margaret's office. I was too young to understand then, but I kept the faces in my memory. I kept their names alive when everyone else forgot. The photographs were the worst part. 9 children's faces, bright with hope in the first pictures, then changing through a series of images that documented their slow destruction. Mary's freckled face growing gaunt and hollow. Johnny's gap-toothed smile fading into blank stares. The twins' bright eyes becoming empty, lifeless. The final photographs showed them here in this basement, strapped to tables while men in white coats stood over them with instruments that had nothing to do with healing. "The fire in 1955, Claire said, understanding dawning in her voice. "It wasn't an accident. Dr. Whitmore came back one last time," Thomas said. "He took what he needed from the files and burned the rest. But he couldn't burn what was down here. He sealed it instead, poured concrete over the entrance, made it disappear from the world above." Thomas moved to the final table, where Catherine's tiny bones lay curled like a sleeping bird. She had been barely 5 years old when they took her, still sucking her thumb. still believing that grown-ups kept children safe. She was the last one to die, Thomas said, his voice breaking. The files say she lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks of asking for Sister Margaret, asking to go home. Claire had stopped taking notes. Some stories were too sacred for newspapers, too terrible for the world to bear. She stood in the yellow circle of flashlight beam, surrounded by the evidence of evil disguised as science, and wept for children she had never known. Thomas knelt beside each table in turn, whispering names that should have been carved in marble, not wired to wrist bones like inventory tags. Mary Gallagher, Amy Brooks, Johnny Morrison, Sarah and Samuel Davis, Ellen Patterson, David Chun, Batir O'Malley, Catherine Rose. They never left, he said finally. Their bodies were buried somewhere else. Unmarked graves in Potter's Fields, probably. But their spirits came home to Thornvale. I felt them in the halls all these years, heard them in the wind through the apple tree. They were waiting for someone to tell their story. As if summoned by their names, a wind moved through the basement, though there were no openings to the world above. It rustled the scattered papers, stirred the dust on the metal tables, and whispered through the bones like a gentle goodbye. Thomas and Claire climbed the stairs in silence, carrying the weight of truth that would change everything. The basement door closed behind them with a final click, but its secrets would never be buried again. Dawn was breaking over Thornvale's hills as Thomas walked to his cottage and retrieved his wood-carving tools. The apple tree stood in the courtyard like a patient sentinel, its ancient bark scarred by decades of weather and time. One by one, Thomas carved their names into the tree's trunk. Deep letters that would outlast any official record, any convenient fire, any attempt to make 9 children disappear from history. Mary, Amy, Johnny, Sarah, Samuel, Ellen, David, Peter, Catherine. As the sun rose fully above the Pennsylvania hills, Thomas stepped back and looked at his work. 9 names circling the tree like a crown, like a prayer, like a promise finally kept. For the first time in 20 years, the wind through the apple tree sounded like laughter instead of tears.